The Christmas Bumpy Johnson saved every child in Harlem. December 23, 1964. Mrs. Dorothy Williams sat at her kitchen table in her small apartment on 125th Street, counting the same $17 for the fourth time, hoping somehow the bills would multiply like the miracle she needed. Her three children, Marcus, age 8, Keisha, age 6, and little Tommy, age 4, had been asking about Christmas presents for weeks. Each night she tucked them into bed with promises that Santa would come, all while knowing that Santa had never visited their neighborhood, not for families like theirs. That evening, as snow began to fall outside her window and Christmas carols played on distant radios, Dorothy Williams did what thousands of mothers in Harlem were doing. She prayed for a miracle. What none of them knew was that their prayers were about to be answered by the last person anyone would expect to play Santa Claus, Bumpy Johnson, the man who ruled Harlem's streets with an iron fist but was about to rule its Christmas with an open heart. The story of how Bumpy Johnson became Harlem's Santa Claus begins not with generosity, but with heartbreak. It was December 15, 1964, when 8-year-old Michael Patterson knocked on Bumpy's office door above Small's Paradise nightclub. Michael was the son of Clara Patterson, a woman who worked as a cleaning lady in 3 different buildings just to pay rent and keep food on the table. "Mr. Johnson," Michael said, his small voice trembling with nervousness, "my mama said I should ask you something." Bumpy looked down at the boy, thin, wearing a coat that was too small and shoes with holes that had been covered with cardboard, but it was Michael's eyes that stopped Bumpy cold. They held a kind of hope that only children possess, the belief that adults can fix anything if they just care enough to try. "What did your mama want you to ask me, son?" she said. "She said maybe you could help us have Christmas this year. She works real hard, but we ain't got money for presents. And my little sister, she's been real good all year. She deserves something from Santa." Bumpy was silent for a long moment. In 30 years of running Harlem streets, he had seen poverty, desperation, and suffering that would break most people's hearts. But something about this child, standing in his office asking not for himself but for his little sister, touched something deep inside him that he had thought was buried forever. "Michael, how many kids in your building don't got Christmas presents?" "Most of them, I think. Maybe all of them." "And how many buildings like yours you think there are in Harlem?" Michael thought hard, his 8-year-old mind trying to process the scope of the question. "A lot, Mr. Johnson. A whole lot." That night, Bumpy couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Michael Patterson and his sister, and all the other children in Harlem who would wake up on Christmas morning to nothing, not because they had been bad, but because their parents worked jobs that paid too little to afford both survival and joy. The next morning, December 16th, Bumpy called a meeting of his organization. Tommy the Ghost Henderson, Junie Bird Jackson, Illinois Gordon, and 15 other men gathered in the back room of Small's Paradise. These were hardened criminals, men who had built their reputations on violence and intimidation. But when Bumpy explained what he wanted to do, every single one of them volunteered to help. "Boss," Tommy said, "you talking about buying Christmas presents for every kid in Harlem? That's got to be thousands of children." 8,437, Bumpy replied. "I had Illinois count them. Every child under the age of 12 in families that can't afford presents." The room was quiet as the men processed what Bumpy was proposing. "That's going to cost a fortune," Junie Bird said. "How much of a fortune?" Illinois asked. Bumpy pulled out a piece of paper covered with calculations. $42,300. "If we spend an average of $5 per child on presents." In 1964, $42,000 was an enormous sum of money. It represented 6 months of profit from Bumpy's entire organization. It was more than most people earned in a lifetime. "Boss," Tommy said carefully, "that's a lot of money to spend on kids who ain't even ours." Bumpy looked around the room at the faces of men who had followed him through wars with rival gangs, police raids, and federal investigations. Men who trusted his judgment about everything from business strategy to life and death decisions. "Let me tell you something," Bumpy said quietly. "Every single one of us grew up poor in neighborhoods like this. Every single one of us knows what it's like to be a kid on Christmas morning with nothing under the tree. And every single one of us became what we became, partly because we learned early that the world doesn't care about poor black children." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Well, maybe it's time the world learned different. Maybe it's time these kids learned that somebody does care, that somebody thinks they deserve to be happy, even if it's just for one morning." By the end of the meeting, Bumpy's organization had committed to the most ambitious Christmas operation in Harlem's history, but buying presents for over 8,000 children was just the beginning of the challenge. Bumpy needed to figure out how to identify every child who needed help, what kind of presents each child would want, and how to distribute them without revealing his involvement or creating chaos. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Bumpy would work through the churches. Harlem had over 30 churches, and every church had members who knew which families were struggling and which children needed help. The pastors could provide lists of children without violating anyone's privacy or dignity, and churches had the infrastructure to distribute presents in an organized, respectful way. On December 17th, Bumpy began visiting pastors throughout Harlem. His approach was the same at each church. He walked in during a quiet moment, introduced himself politely, and made an offer that no one could refuse. "Reverend," he would say, "I want to make sure that every child in your congregation has presents on Christmas morning. No questions asked, no publicity, no recognition, just children being happy on Christmas." Most of the pastors knew who Bumpy Johnson was. They knew his reputation, his methods, his business, but they also knew that his offer was sincere and that thousands of children would have a better Christmas because of his generosity. By December 20th, every church in Harlem had provided Bumpy with lists of children in need. The total was even higher than his estimate, 9,247 children. Now came the logistical challenge of actually buying nearly 10,000 Christmas presents in 3 days. Bumpy divided his men into teams and sent them to every toy store, department store, and variety shop in New York City. They had specific instructions: buy good presents, age-appropriate presents, presents that would make children feel special and loved. No cheap toys, no broken merchandise, nothing that would disappoint a child on Christmas morning. The sight of Bumpy's men shopping for Christmas presents became one of the most unusual spectacles in New York retail history. Hardened criminals stood in toy store aisles, carefully reading age recommendations on board games and asking salespeople about the educational value of different toys. Tommy the Ghost spent 4 hours in FAO Schwartz, consulting with staff about which dolls would be best for 6-year-old girls. Illinois Gordon became an expert on model trains and building sets. Junie Bird Jackson learned more about children's books in 2 days than he had known in his entire life. By December 22nd, Bumpy's organization had purchased over $47,000 worth of Christmas presents. The presents were stored in 3 different warehouses, organized by age and gender, wrapped by teams of volunteers that included the wives and girlfriends of Bumpy's associates. But the most challenging part of the operation was still to come: distribution. Bumpy couldn't simply deliver thousands of presents to individual homes. That would create too much attention and might embarrass families who were proud despite their poverty. Instead, he worked with the churches to create a system that would preserve dignity while ensuring every child received presents. On December 23rd, every church in Harlem announced that they had received an anonymous donation that would allow them to provide Christmas presents for children in their congregations. Parents could come to the church, verify their children's names on a list, and receive wrapped presents for each child. The response was immediate and overwhelming. At Abyssinian Baptist Church, a line of parents stretched around the block. At St. Philip's Episcopal Church, families waited for hours in the snow. At Mount Olivet Baptist Church, mothers wept with gratitude as they carried bags of presents home to children who had been expecting nothing. Dorothy Williams arrived at her church at 6 a.m. on December 23rd, 2 hours before the distribution was scheduled to begin. She wasn't taking any chances that the presents might run out before she got there. When the church doors opened, Dorothy presented the names of her 3 children to the volunteer at the table. The volunteer checked the names against a master list, then handed Dorothy 3 bags of wrapped presents, 1 bag for each child. The volunteer said with a smile, "And there's something extra in each bag from Santa." Dorothy Williams carried those bags home like they contained precious jewels. That night, she placed them under the small Christmas tree she had managed to buy with part of her $17, and for the first time in weeks, she went to sleep without worrying about Christmas morning. December 24th, Christmas Eve, was quiet in Harlem, but it was a different kind of quiet than usual. Instead of the tension that often filled the neighborhood, there was a sense of anticipation, of joy waiting to be unwrapped. In apartments throughout Harlem, children went to bed early, excited about Christmas morning. Parents sat up late, looking at the presents under their trees, still hardly believing that this Christmas would be different. December 25th, 1964, Christmas morning in Harlem. 8-year-old Marcus Williams woke up first, as he always did. But when he ran to the living room, he stopped so suddenly that his little brother Tommy crashed into him from behind. Under the tree were presents. Real presents, wrapped in bright paper with ribbons and bows. More presents than Marcus had ever seen in his life. "Mama," Marcus yelled. "Mama, come quick. Santa came. Santa really came." Dorothy Williams appeared in the doorway of the living room, still wearing her bathrobe, and gasped. The 3 bags of presents she had placed under the tree had somehow multiplied. There were toys for each child, books, games, and in each bag, just as the volunteer had promised, something extra: new winter coats, warm shoes, and for Dorothy herself, an envelope containing $200 in cash, and a note that said simply, "For a good mother, from a friend." Scenes like this were repeated in thousands of homes throughout Harlem that Christmas morning. Children who had gone to bed expecting nothing woke up to rooms filled with presents. Parents who had been dreading Christmas morning found themselves crying tears of joy as they watched their children's faces light up with wonder and happiness. But the most remarkable thing wasn't the presents themselves, it was what happened in the community. Word spread quickly that someone had made sure every child in Harlem had Christmas presents. Neighbors began visiting each other, sharing the joy, comparing the toys their children had received. Children who had never had enough to share were suddenly sharing with friends who had also received presents. The streets of Harlem on Christmas Day 1964 were filled with children playing with new toys, parents talking with neighbors they rarely spoke to, and a sense of community that hadn't existed in years. At Small's Paradise, Bumpy Johnson spent Christmas Day alone in his office, listening to the sounds of children playing in the streets below. Tommy the Ghost found him there at sunset. "Boss, you should see it out there. Kids everywhere. Happy as I've ever seen kids be. Parents crying with joy. The whole neighborhood feels different." Bumpy nodded, still looking out the window. "Good. How you feeling about spending all that money?" Bumpy was quiet for a moment. "Tommy, I've spent money on a lot of things in my life. Women, cars, clothes, weapons, bribes. This is the first time I spent money on something that made the world better instead of worse. You think we'll do it again next year? If we're still here, if we still can, then yes, we'll do it every year." And they did. For the next 4 years, until Bumpy's death in 1968, Harlem's children never had another Christmas without presents. The operation became more sophisticated each year, with better organization, more volunteers, and even more presents. But the Christmas of 1964 remained special. It was the Christmas that proved that redemption was possible for anyone, that even the hardest heart could be softened by a child's hope, and that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is make sure that children believe in miracles. Word of Bumpy's Christmas operation eventually spread beyond Harlem. Newspaper reporters heard rumors about the mysterious benefactor who made sure poor children had presents. Social workers talked about the dramatic drop in despair and domestic violence that occurred in Harlem every Christmas. Even the police noticed that crime rates fell significantly during the holiday season. But Bumpy never confirmed his involvement publicly. When asked directly about the Christmas presents, he would simply smile and say, "Santa Claus works in mysterious ways." The children who received presents from Bumpy's Christmas operation never forgot the experience. Many of them, now grandparents themselves, still tell the story of the Christmas when someone cared enough to make sure they weren't forgotten. Some of those children grew up to become teachers, social workers, ministers, and community leaders, inspired by the lesson that one person's generosity can change an entire community. In 1968, when Bumpy Johnson died, thousands of people attended his funeral. But mixed in with the flowers and traditional funeral wreaths were dozens of small, handmade cards from children. Cards that said "Thank you for Christmas," and "You were our Santa Claus," and "We won't forget." Dorothy Williams, whose children had received some of the first presents in 1964, brought her grandchildren to Bumpy's funeral. She told them that while the man they were honoring had done things that weren't always good, he had also done something that was purely good, something that had made Christmas magical for thousands of children who thought they had been forgotten by the world. The Christmas of 1964 proved something that Bumpy Johnson had suspected but never been sure of, that it was possible to change the world, not through violence or intimidation or fear, but through simple human kindness. That even a man who had built his life on darkness could create light, if he was willing to open his heart to the innocence and hope of children. Every Christmas morning for the rest of her life, Dorothy Williams would look at her family gathered around their Christmas tree and remember the morning when her children learned that miracles were real. Not because of divine intervention, but because someone who had every reason to be bitter about the world had chosen instead to make it sweeter. That's the true meaning of Christmas in Harlem, 1964. Not just presents under trees, but the gift of knowing that someone cares, someone is watching, and someone believes that every child deserves to wake up on Christmas morning feeling loved and special and worthy of joy. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, but every December, when Christmas carols fill the air and children make lists for Santa, the spirit of that magical Christmas lives on in the memory of a community that learned that sometimes the most important gift you can give is the gift of hope.